Good afternoon, everyone. It is Monday, April 27th, 2020. I'm Keir Murray. I'm a Houston-based political and public affairs consultant. I'm joined by longtime University of Houston political scientist and my father, Richard Murray. Dad, welcome. I thought we'd start out as we do in these COVID crisis meetings that we've been having for the last several weeks, take an assessment of where we are today, now weeks into this crisis. I believe we've got about 1 million confirmed cases in the United States and tragically nearly 60,000 deaths in the next few days, we think. Uh, Obviously, in economic freefall, both nationally and acutely here in Texas and the Houston area, given some of the challenges going on in the energy industry. What's your assessment today of where we stand?
Well, we're in a deep hole, and there's no light at the end of the tunnel yet. Most of the health professionals are giving us more sobering news. Deborah Birx said over the weekend, social distancing is going to be with us through the summer. I think very likely much later into the year. We're seeing the trend lines flatten out in terms of new infections and deaths. The hotspots are moving around, but the overall numbers are pretty discouraging. The idea that we would go up pretty fast and then come down is pretty clearly not being borne out by the data. So we got a mess on the healthcare front. Again, any notion that the economy, which went downhill very fast, could recover very quickly just seems to be magical thinking. This looks like very likely a hockey stick pattern where you go down fast and then flatten out, and it takes a long time to rebuild. So the health and economic issues are bad, and the political impact generally to this point hurts the president. We're beginning to see his numbers have softened, and his performance has become, I think, even more erratic, if not bizarre.
Yeah, let's talk about that for a minute. As we know, over the last few weeks, the president had been doing these daily briefings that were ostensibly set up for the task force, the White House task force on coronavirus, but which he would essentially play the starring role. Some of the medical experts and Mike Pence and others would be on hand to do a little bit of briefing and answer questions, but then it would very quickly change to just an engagement with Trump and the various White House press corps. Some of these going on for 2.5 hours at a time. Those were abruptly discontinued a couple of days ago. There was some speculation in national media that those around the president and perhaps he himself concluded that they weren't necessarily helping him politically. I believe he is, while he's not doing a briefing of this kind this evening, he is scheduling some sort of press conference in the Rose Garden today. Not clear, at least I don't know what the details of that are, but what do you see about this, where this daily briefings are going, interrupting them? Was that a good idea? You think he'll start them back up at some point? I'm curious to get your take there.
Well, I think most professional political consultants and campaign-oriented people say this last 2 weeks have been pretty much a disaster, that the president goes off script, says sometimes truly harmful things like the talking about ingesting, Clorox or cleansers. And briefly he seems to pull back, but he can't stay away from the limelight. Like again, switching out to the Rose Garden this afternoon. So this would be an incredibly challenging situation for a terrifically gifted president in handling crises, and he's not rising to the occasion to this point.
Yeah, and we saw over the weekend some speculation from national Republicans concerned that his performance so far during this crisis has become politically damaging, not only to himself, but potentially to down ballot Republicans in the U.S. Senate, in U.S. House races, as well as legislative races around the country. How do you see that shaping up right now? I realize it's early days. We have 6 months plus to go until the election, but how do you see that shaping up? We've seen some polling coming out, as you mentioned, that shows some erosion in his job performance, both nationally and in a number of swing states. What do you think about this sort of alarm bells that are being sounded by national Republicans?
Well, I think the Senate Republicans are truly very worried now that although most of their large number of seats that are up are in quite red states that Trump won, uh, their own polling in a lot of states looks like it's going south, particularly in North Carolina, Maine, Arizona, Colorado. Republicans only have one good pickup opportunity in the country, that's in Alabama, have 4 seats that are hugely at risk and another 5 or 6 that could be lost. So the damage in the recent term that the president is doing to himself clearly is spilling over to Republicans on the ballot this year. There's virtually no chance now that Republicans can retake the House. They're being vastly outraised in funding. They've had trouble recruiting good candidates in most districts. So the House looks like it's very likely going to stay a solid Democratic majority. But the Senate now is truly in play.
And yeah, and what do you think about a state like Texas? We haven't seen a lot of polling out of Texas, but we did see one over the weekend from the Texas Tribune that I believe showed the president with a modest lead here of about 5 points. But if you look under the hood in that polling data, there's some interesting numbers. Namely, it showed Joe Biden potentially getting a third or better of support of white voters in Texas, who make up about 2/3 of the electorate in a presidential year. And my understanding of the way the math works, having worked on campaigns here for a number of years, is that if you're getting into that 34-35% support among white voters in Texas, given how you're likely to perform among non-white voters, you're getting in the ballpark of being able to carry the state. What's your assessment of that?
I think that's correct. And a lot of things are in flux. Normally, the small but growing Asian vote has been pretty friendly to Republicans. But Trump continues with things like suspending visas that terrifically impacts the Asian Indian community to alienate those folks. And in both Dallas, Fort Worth, Houston, and Austin, we have sizable and growing Asian voters. And that's going to make these urban counties landslide counties because there's just not enough conservative Anglos in the Dallas, Fort Worth, Houston, or Austin metro areas for the president to even keep the margins close. About 69% of all the voters in Texas are in these 4 big metro regions, including San Antonio. If you lose them by more than about 56-44, you probably can't carry the state, that you can't make up enough in the 23% of the outstate that's not Hispanic to overcome the deficit in the large metro areas.
Yeah. And what do you think about the U.S. Senate race in Texas? Obviously, John Cornyn, the senior senator running for re-election, in the Tribune poll of job approval only in the high 30s, about even, with I think it was 38-36 approval, disapproval with Texas voters. Democrats don't have a nominee yet. They will in a couple of months, either M.J. Hager or Royce West, senator from Dallas. Is Cornyn vulnerable, and to what extent do you think Trump's performance will potentially affect Cornyn's on the ballot here and then the other races down ballot?
Well, I think this race, to an unusual degree, will be dominated by voters' perceptions of the president and how well he's responded to the pandemic and now the terrific economic crisis. The Trump campaign will try to make Joe Biden the issue, but Joe Biden, is not running anything right now. And Trump is. And so Cornyn's fate is tied to a very great degree to the president's. If the president does not win Texas, it's tough for Cornyn to win. Cornyn is very different than Ted Cruz. Cruz has a large number of people who really dislike him, but he also had a large number of people that really supported him. Cornyn doesn't have either of those. He's not a highly visible senator. He doesn't have an awful lot of strong supporters. And another factor that we'll get to later, but it's critically important here in Texas in our Senate and congressional races, the near collapse of the energy industry. That's the single biggest financial support base of Republicans. And we're looking at tens of thousands of workers in that industry losing their jobs, some of whom will leave the state. And in a very close election, the troubles in the oil patch could really be quite decisive here in Texas. For example, locally, I think whatever chance Wesley Hunt might have had to recapture the seat that Lizzie Fletcher won 2 years ago, probably gone out the window with the oil bust.
Yeah, and just to return a little bit to President and then move into Joe Biden, there were some stories, some national stories over the weekend. One, I think in the Times, describing the way the president is typically spending his day during this crisis. It's a story that he disputes, by the way, but basically saying that he spends a large portion of the morning watching television, then maybe gets on the phone for a period of time, and then shows up at the briefings in the evening. This is contrasted by a piece that I saw over the weekend that talked about how Joe Biden is spending his time trying to prepare, if he's able to win, on how he would run the country, what he would do to combat this crisis on both the public health and the economic front, try to move the country forward, taking regular meetings with his staff. How do you see that contrast setting up, at least as it stands now?
Well, I've long believed in the adage that Jim Baker, one of our most successful political managers from Houston, Secretary of State for George Bush, ran George H.W. Bush's campaign, said his dad taught him prior preparation prevents poor performance, PPPP. Trump doesn't do that. He doesn't prepare. He gets poor performances. Biden looks like he's following the Jim Baker playbook. He knows if he's successful, which is a huge if, that he's going to inherit an incredibly challenging environment, and that he's going to have to be as well prepared as possible. So he's taking advantage of the fact that he is hunkered down, but he can talk to experts around the country with Zoom and other things, start trying to figure out where do we go from here, meaning, he would be if he's successful, he will have about 2.5 months to prepare for actually being sworn in, but it really will need to hit the ground running. And I think his schedule reflects that he's making this major effort to prepare himself. I expect to identify people that he will want and need in his administration, in addition, of course, to settling on a vice presidential pick.
Yeah, and I want to come back with Biden to an issue that we discussed a few weeks ago, and that's this allegation of sexual misconduct from about 25 years ago. A woman who was a staffer of his at the time alleged. It looks like to me in the last couple of days there's been some further corroboration of that. There was a video clip of someone calling in to Larry King's show during that time frame, who they're now saying may have been this woman's late mother, complaining about her daughter's treatment and inability to get anybody to take it seriously. As well, today there was a story, I believe, in Business Insider about a woman who was a neighbor of this Ms. Reed, who says contemporaneously that she discussed this with her. What do you make of this story as it evolves? I mean, do you think it has legs, and if it does, what will it mean for the race?
I think it'll have legs because it's an absolutely appropriate line of inquiry. And it will be pursued, if for no other reason, that the president is going to have to try to increase Joe Biden's negatives, and he's got a formidable campaign operation and allied media. So this story will have some legs, but it is in the distant past, so corroborating something that happened a quarter century ago is not easy. And of course, the Trump campaign is not in a great position to run a campaign on personal morality and sexual harassment matters. So I don't think it will be a game changer. I think it's a legitimate area of inquiry. We'll probably hear some more about it. But it's tough for the Trump campaign to run a lot of ads on a much less substantiated story than his own recent track record. And with multiple live cases out there that are much farther along in the legal process.
Yeah, and I think just thinking as an operative myself, what I'd be looking for is more than one, because any time you can establish a pattern of conduct, and again, I have no information one way or the other whether there are any other allegations out there, but if there are, that would probably make it more complicated and a more powerful story.
Well, we know that there are powerful incentives for people to keep digging and digging and digging for those. just as there was in efforts to discredit Barack Obama, which basically turned up nothing. But you know, the story will go where the story goes.
Yeah. I want to talk a little bit about a subject we've talked about previously, and that's the mechanism of voting. And I know we keep coming back to it, but it's really, really important, and it's highly in doubt these days. We saw today, I believe, that the state of New York flat out canceled its presidential primary, which had already been postponed to late June. They just got rid of it altogether. I think the rest of the primary goes forward later in the late summer or early fall. But which leads me again to thinking about the mechanism of voting here in Texas. As we've discussed, there's litigation going on at both the state and federal level in Texas about allowing potentially more Texans to request a mail ballot if they want one, regardless of whether they're 65 or older, or disabled or living outside the state, which are the usual rules or requirements that you have to meet one of to be able to do that. What do you think about this mechanism of voting in the fall, since we don't know where we're going to be with this crisis from a public health standpoint?
I think it's a huge issue, potentially disastrous. We're a really big state, and unlike some of the other large ones, we don't have a robust mail ballot program in place. We have come to rely very heavily on in-person early voting, but that is high density. Social distancing is very hard. And if Texas, as I believe, is going to be a very close state with 38 electoral votes at stake, we may find ourselves in another one of these god-awful crises like in 1876, which, contrary to rumor, I was not around at the time, but I sure was around in 2000, Bush v. Gore. And you got a bunch of things that are locked in, like the electors must meet in mid-December in the state capitol all over the country. You can't single Texas out and say, oh, you guys work that out later. They have one chance to write out their ballot, and it has to go to Washington. And of course, that was the rationale the Supreme Court used to intervene and say, well, we got to stop this. And we could well be right back in the same damn mix 7 months from now. If our ballots are called into dispute and you can't determine who won the electoral vote from Texas, and the margin is less than 38 votes, so the Texas decision could end up like Florida, deciding the next president of the United States. And our democracy surely doesn't need another election that half the country would consider to be illegitimate. So we've got to really work here in Texas to try to figure out how in the hell we can create an election where people can go vote with some confidence if they're not putting their health at risk.
So it seems like there's some possible ways that could be addressed, right? One is, as we've discussed, is loosening the requirements to allow anyone or more people than are currently eligible to vote by mail. The other could potentially be, for example, extending the early voting period, which is now think about 12 days for a general election, widening that, maybe doubling it or making it a month long. I don't know how realistic a prospect that is. But as we saw in the sort of disastrous Wisconsin primary several weeks ago, part of the issue with in-person voting is finding staff to work these locations, right? For example, in Milwaukee, you had a situation where you went from something like 200 polling places down to 5, largely because they couldn't get anybody to work at the election. And if we're still under social distancing requirements, where you're having to space people out, the elimination of straight ticket voting, which is going to lengthen the period of time it takes a voter in the ballot box to cast his or her ballot, plus the requirements that you'd likely have to sort of regularly clean the machines to make sure that they're sanitized for every individual voter. This strikes me as a recipe for just unbelievable problems, especially in a county like ours, which is going to have upwards of 2.5 million voters registered by November. And we're going to see as many as 1.5 million people vote in the presidential election. How can we, be thinking about how to facilitate this process so that we don't have a disastrous outcome in that regard in the general election?
Well, here in Harris County, the county clerk who's responsible for administering the election day voting will be before the commissioner's court tomorrow, asking for several $1 million with 3 different scenarios. One is to manage 2 million mail ballots. That would mean virtually everybody's voting by mail. About maybe 1.2 million, which would mean predominantly mail ballots, but still a lot of in-person voting. and then a more minimalist 700,000 mail ballots, which would mean we're still casting a majority of our votes in person. I expect that the Commissioner's Court, where now has a Democratic majority, will approve that funding request. So I think the big urban counties where the problem is probably going to be the most severe, the local election officials are moving along, but we've still got these two lawsuits, one in federal court, one in state court. The Secretary of State has not issued clear guidelines. So we have huge amounts of uncertainty besides all the problems we have about what the hell the virus is doing. But yes, back to the point about workers, in the story in the Texas Tribune that ran this week, some of the local election administrators say 65% of their workers are over 65. It's going to be particularly difficult to recruit seniors to come in and do their civic duty. You know, election day work doesn't pay much money. It's a civic duty kind of deal. So we have to have a whole variety of strategies to keep this from spiraling out of control and just becoming an absolute disaster. And one of those is trying to recruit younger, healthier workers. Maybe we can enlist college students. You know, the data suggests that young adults are at pretty low risk. Even if they get an infection, that usually is not going to be life-threatening or even make them very sick. But we've got to think outside the box here now that we have some time. And we also need some kind of clarity on what are the rules going to be. Can we really augment with a big mail ballot program? If not, we've got the much more difficult problem of trying to figure out, which they did not do in Milwaukee, in Wisconsin, of how we can safely get people to vote in person.
Yeah, and I think, you know, part of what complicated the situation in Wisconsin is there was a big dispute about whether to delay the primary at all, and then it ended up happening. The governor tried to do it the day before, after a lot of votes had already been cast, and you know, you had a hostile legislature and state Supreme Court, et cetera. So, I mean, we don't need to rehash all of that, but I mean, I worry about that. And again, the Harris County, for example, has one of the longest ballots in America. We've got all these judge races, and so it's going to take voters a long time anyway to under ideal circumstances to cast their ballot with the disappearance of straight ticket voting.
Also, we've got a lot of municipal jurisdictions that were supposed to have their elections this month, May. Those have been postponed in places like Pearland. So besides all of the other stuff, you get to the bottom of the ballot and you've got to vote for mayor and council. So we're just going to have a horrendous time. Voting by mail, one of its great attractions is that people can take a couple hours and just sit down and work on their ballot when it's convenient. And, you know, if you're standing in line, particularly worrying about catching a severe illness, you're going to be really pushing, you know, and it's not a good thing for political democracy, in my view. 5 states do almost exclusive mail balloting, and another 2/3, 24 use it as a major source. So this is not unproven technique, but we need to start moving fast
And interestingly, like I know that the president and some other Republican elected officials have sort of raised alarms about expanding mail ballot voting, but a number of the states that use it are controlled by Republican governors and legislatures. And my understanding is the research doesn't show there's any clear benefit to any side in doing this. And the polling that I've seen shows it's quite popular with the public, regardless of their partisan leanings. And so it would seem to be a pretty non-controversial decision, but there seems to be a lot of hesitation, especially in a state like Texas, about potentially moving forward with expanding that, you know, allowing who gets to do it.
Well, it reflects the fact that Trump has totally taken over the Republican Party. Before Trump, many Republicans were promoting vote by mail, and some still are, like Governor DeWine in Ohio. But Trump has made this another polarizing partisan issue with comments like, you know, if we do mail voting, Republicans will never win another election, which is total BS. They win lots of elections with mail ballots. But right now, you know, he sets the tone. And in Texas, Republican leaders don't want to cross the president publicly. But yes, there's no clear evidence that this is a particular bonanza to Democrats. It just makes voting a lot more convenient for a lot of Americans.
Yeah. And sort of the last big subject I wanted to talk about today was, you know, we've seen a variety of approaches to restrictions placed on citizenry in various states and localities around the country. some places like Georgia looking to open things up pretty early in terms of trying to return businesses to normal. Here in Texas, we've seen a governor who seems to be proceeding pretty cautiously, either way, not wanting to do too much or too little. Some local counties, like Harris, for example, Dallas, and others, have been more aggressive in things like requiring citizens to wear masks, as we saw go into effect here today in Harris County for the next month or so. What do you what do you see that? How's that tension playing out between state government? Some conservatives who say this is, we're killing the economy. This is an unfair burden on the citizenry, versus the folks on the public health side saying, no, we're flattening the curve because we're taking these precautions. How do you see that's going?
I think a lot of it is political theater or political posturing. You're not going to successfully, quote, open the economy until you deal with the healthcare crisis, because large sectors of the economy are not going to recover if people worry that if I go to this deal or this store, I might get sick. So you can do all the opening in the world, but if nobody comes, you haven't changed the economic equation much. And big sectors of our economy depend upon their business model requires very high density. And there's no way you can open rock concerts at NRG Stadium to 70,000 people. And so that sector is not going to come back. You can open movie theaters. Atlanta's got some open. Is anybody going to show up? Probably not. The largest chain's not going to open. Yes, restaurants can be phased in with maybe half the capacity of their old seating pattern. So we'll do these gradual, slow openings that will be helpful for some small businesses. And people that have confidence in their hairdressers or stylists or whomever may well frequent some of these businesses and involve close contact. But based on the professionals, you'd be a fool to go to a densely crowded, enclosed environment. All the data we're getting is that's where you really are at great risk of getting the virus, much less so outside. So, some businesses that can spread out into a larger open area can probably do pretty well. But much of our business community is, they've got to have some kind of assured public before anything approaching normality is possible.
Yeah, and it frankly raises interesting questions about the future of office work, right? Where you've got people going into densely populated, cubicle areas and small conference rooms for meetings. These are places that the public health professionals are saying are much higher risk for contracting the virus. And I don't know how that will play out, but I think it's gonna be interesting to see how office, professional businesses try to adapt to this in terms of who goes into the office and when, and how they're spaced out, and what kinds of requirements are placed on in-person meetings and that sort of thing. I mean, it's not going to be easy to work out, it seems to me.
No. And of course, I'm in a business, college teaching, where I guess from our traditionalist mode, the good news is students don't like this distance learning. There's an awful lot of complaining across the spectrum that we want to get back to the campus environment that has a lot of other attributes that students find rewarding, including interacting with their peers. But yeah, the whole way of our life before the first day of March 2020 has been changed. It's going to keep changing. It'll be years before we sort of sort many of these things out. And the only comparable situation, I think, is what happened to the country in the 1930s, which took a whole decade to work out.
Yeah, I saw someone joking on social media that Harvard better figure out what they're going to do, because these parents aren't paying for the University of Phoenix. Right. So
the tuition's a little higher at Harvard.
Yes. Okay. Well, I mean, I think, is there anything you want to sort of say in conclusion? And we can try to take a few questions if folks have them.
No, if the people have questions, let's get to those.
Okay. Forgive me so I can see if anybody's got a question, just pipe in either by chat, or if you can try to unmute yourself. I think you can do that. Anyone?
Yeah, I have a question.
Sure, Ellen. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. Thank you, Dick and Keir. When you were talking about the mail-in ballots, I'm a little bit confused. So is the ultimate decision about mail-in ballots left in the hands of the governor?
Well, that's not clear. We have a pretty decentralized system traditionally that give the local election authorities a lot of flexibility. Uh, but, you know, uh, we don't know what the rules are. The Secretary of State is, of course, the state officer who is an appointee of the governor that is supposed to issue, if there are any, clear guidelines for local officials. She has not chosen to do so far. I assume she's going to wait and see how this litigation goes. But again,
So we can, I'm sorry, Dick, but so there, in the state of Texas, we can have mail-in ballots obviously in Houston, and no mail-in ballots in Dallas, and mail-in ballots in El Paso. I mean, it can be that convoluted.
well, the state law allows that anyone 65 or older has an automatic request. Anyone who's in jail, who's not been convicted of a felony, who's a registered voter. Certain classes of Texans have a clear legal right anywhere to cast a mail ballot. But local officials vary in how much they promote this. So some counties have a much more robust outreach program to encourage, and that would be critically important if we widen or open up the window for mail voting. What's the locals doing? Because the state doesn't have any program of that nature, but it will be awfully important what kind of voter outreach, because most Texans have not cast a vote by mail. I've assisted my late mother-in-law casting, so I'm familiar with the process, but it's new to people. It's a little bit complicated. You got to be careful about certain things. And again, we have a lot of voters that have no experience with this system.
Yeah, I think just to get at the sort of crux at the litigation, as I understand it as a non-lawyer, is the argument that those suing the state and in federal court are making is essentially that fear of contracting COVID constitutes a disability, potentially. And so that should qualify anyone who wants to vote by mail because of a disability, which is what part of what the state law allows for. So part of this would, as Dad said, would be what those counties would be willing to do in terms of outreach. But I think the litigation is important also because the political parties can really do a lot of this outreach too, right? Both at the state and the local level. If you have the local Democratic and Republican parties pushing more of their base voters to cast a vote by mail, that I think could help drive up participation if it turns out to be allowed, right? So, and that I don't know whether it will be, but.
And when the parties get involved, they can gin up hundreds of thousands of more voters. I mean, it's just, they've got the resources to do individual contact, to tell their base voters, this is important, make sure you get your ballot. They track whether you've sent it back in or not. So it can, in addition to what the public authorities are doing, the Republicans and the Democrats can really hype this process up.
Right. Can anybody else have questions they want to weigh in with? Anyone? Okay. Well, I think that's going to wrap us up for today. Dad, thank you as always. Our social distancing work continues, and have a good week, everyone. And let's hope this gets better sooner rather than later. Talk to you next time.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.